Welcome to Shared Practices, the podcast that teaches you how to own your own dental practice from start to finish. This is episode 1.5, and I'm your host, Dr. Richard Lowe. We're joining you with the last episode of this first week of the podcast. It's a little bit late because we had lit review in my residency on Friday, and I had to know 10 papers in depth where they could call on me and to present any one of those papers, and I could present it as well as anyone else in the room. So anyways, we're still on this topic of ownership. And we're taking so long on this because I don't want to set anyone up for failure. I don't want to oversell this idea of ownership and have someone walk into it because, podcast said it was great. I don't think I have to worry about that too much, though, because corporate dentistry, student loans, all these factors are pushing away a lot of people from doing it. So I don't need to dissuade people per se, but I want people to go in with their eyes wide open of pros, cons, challenges, and how their personality is going to either help or hinder them or how they can overcome that going into ownership. However, I did ask this question to the Brain Trust, Alan Mead's Brain Trust, and I basically said, everyone knows someone who maybe shouldn't own their own practice. What do these people share in common? And I got back some really good answers. So one of them was from Dr. Melissa Zettler, and she said, people who shouldn't own. Okay. They are people who don't want to manage the team. They don't want to look at numbers. They want to just show up and go home. They only want to make more, quote unquote. Anyone who can't keep track of deadlines, like taxes and payroll, for example. People who don't like to confront issues. Another member of the Brain Trust, Dr. Michael Keller, said, people who don't like to deal with people and who just want to show up and leave. So if you hate numbers and or people, that seems to be a common thread. You're going to have to deal with numbers. You're going to have to deal with people. And I think that's where the most stress comes from. A lot of us don't have a huge financial numbers background. And maybe some of us like to help people, but when you have to hold people accountable or train people or fire people, that's when things get a little more stressful, when you have to be the boss. There was a book I read recently called Drive by Daniel Pink. In the book, they talk about a study that was done in the 70s about paying this group of subjects to do a puzzle versus the control group that they didn't pay. And the group that got paid, interestingly enough, got bored and gave up faster than the group who was just doing the puzzle for themselves. And so this book explores the idea of intrinsic motivation, of what genuinely motivates us and gets us out of bed and makes us happy rather than just money, which really anything that you do for money at some point becomes a job if it doesn't have these other factors. So the three things he talked about were autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And that these three things caused people to work harder and longer and be happier and more satisfied and innovate more than people who were just paid more money to motivate them more. Out of the three of these, the thing that jumps out to me the most about an associateship versus ownership is autonomy and purpose. Autonomy ultimately is this, how much control do I have over my work and my environment and the people that I'm around and the direction that I'm going? And as an associate, you inherently don't have that control. And consistently, the members of the Brain Trust voiced this idea of autonomy as being their favorite part of being a practice owner. So David Scardella said, favorite part is being able to practice the way I want, use the materials I want, and do the procedures I want. James Heaton said, I get to pick my team, I create the culture I desire in my office, practice growth is extremely rewarding, and ownership can provide a nicer lifestyle. And later on, Melissa Zettler seconded this. She said, I agree 1,000,000 times with the statement that you get to create your culture. You decide how your days feel, what people to surround yourself with. Getting to choose materials and equipment matters too, but the culture, that's where it's at. And you can see how mastery and purpose, the other two factors of this happiness and motivation trifecta, play in too, because if you're the owner, you're making more money and able to make investments in technology and CE and systems that are going to allow you to develop your skills, maybe even a little bit more. It's hard to get into implants and other advanced procedures if you don't have control of the equipment and the schedule and the systems and the employees. Purpose, when you're building your own practice and creating your own vision, it's a lot different than working for someone else, building their vision. And a lot of times you just can't see their vision, either because they haven't communicated it clearly, or you just straight up disagree. The way they practice and what they're all about in their practice isn't what you're all about. And that's okay. But ultimately, you want to be building your own thing, leaving your own legacy, and doing dentistry in a way that you love it, that motivates you. So sorry to get on a little soapbox and maybe I talked too long, but I just thought I wanted to share both those thoughts from the Brain Trust and frame them in this context of the motivation trifecta from the book Drive by Dan Pink. We mentioned in the previous episode a request from one of our listeners, and that was a request for reviews of different corporate chains. So we haven't heard anything back from anyone, but we're going to still do our best to collect stories and recommendations by people who have been working in corporate chains in the last 2 to 3 years. So if anyone in graduated class of 2015, 2014, 2013, if you could post on your Facebook dental page, because all of you have Facebook dental pages, if you could post, hey, what have been your experiences working for different corporate chains? And would you be willing to talk about it? I've got this guy who wants to compile a bunch of experiences for new grads to be able to choose and make decisions based off of. And you can give him my email, richard@sharedpractices.com, or you can send him to our website. Today, we have with us Dr. David Maloley, who is someone that I really look up to and respect because he is a former Army dentist who served his country, got some great experiences, and then turned around and opened a practice in some of the worst conditions that he could have started a practice in, has succeeded and thrived. And then he went and turned around and released a podcast. So I respect him in so many ways, and I'm excited for you guys to hear his opinions on taking the plunge into practice ownership. I want to look at when is it maybe contraindicated for someone to become a practice owner. So I wanted to hear your perspective on why is practice ownership worth it for you? And maybe who would be someone that you might be hesitant to say that they should move into practice ownership? And how can you know? Like, how can I know if maybe I should stay in the Army, or maybe I should be an associate, or maybe I should own a practice? How would you go about making that decision?
I think it goes really back to intuition, meaning I think being an entrepreneur is in a lot of people's DNA. I remember as a child trying to develop ideas that may be future business, whether it be something hokey like an ice cream parlor or whatever, or a clothing line or whatever. So, I grew up on a farm and I didn't have a lot. Later on, my father had a small business, so I was exposed to some of that, what it meant to have employees and have headaches on the weekends and the evenings when other people don't. But I feel like it was always in my DNA. And some of these things you can do like a Kolbe and check your profile and see, personality traits that tend to lend to being an entrepreneur. So that's some people just know that they don't want that stuff. They don't want to have to worry about maternity leave and sick employees and people asking for bonuses. And if that's a complete turnoff to you, if leadership and practice business growth is a turnoff to you in your gut, then I think then it would be a tough road. I think it's going to be a tough road. But I think if you have that itch and you went into dentistry for autonomy and to be a business owner, then that's an itch that you must scratch.
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned a test or a personality test. What was the name of that one?
It's Kolbe. I've seen it associated with a couple different organizations. Okay. And I've taken like Myers-Briggs. Sure. But this one talks about your work personality. And it's kind of a cradle to the grave test, meaning I'm in my 40s, and if I took it again in my 60s, it's not likely to change hardly at all.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And the proper thing to do, because you find out a lot about yourself, but you also find a lot about your employees. It's Kolbe, and I don't pretend to be an expert.
Okay.
But when I got my report back, all of a sudden I realized all the things that were really hard for me, why they were hard for me, and all the things that were really easy for me, and it seemed like I couldn't figure out why it was hard for anyone else.
Right.
It's kind of explained in that test. So, for example, one of the things that I score really high on is quick start. And that means I have an idea and I can just go for it. Whereas my fact finder level is quite low, meaning I don't need to know the minutia about the cone beam unit before I invest $100,000 in it. Some people will sit on that for 8 years before they make a decision, and I'm able to make decisions relatively quickly, say relative to a normal dentist, but that's that's not a skill I've developed. It's something that is within me.
Well, and I just know I'm the opposite. I'm kind of one of these, I want to research it and see all the reviews and know all the pros and cons and the alternatives. And ironically, there was a book, I'm trying to remember the name of it. I'll put it in the show notes. But it's this idea that more choices can sometimes be a bad thing. And
Paradox of choice, yeah.
Paradox of choice, that's the one. And those who go and research ad nauseum everything, now they know what they're missing out on, and they know the flaws of everything, and then they end up being less happy with what they got in the end. And I know that's me. That's totally me. And that's probably why I'm starting a podcast 5 years before I could even own a practice. And so I know that's going to be a weakness for me, and making decisions in my practice and deciding between hiring this person or that person, or buying this equipment or that equipment, or going with this company or that company. I might need to find someone that's more like you to be on my team that can help me move along with that decision. But that's something built in, like you said. That's just a personality thing.
And it doesn't need, the one thing that Kolbe stresses, and I should stress, is that they don't see any profile as a negative. It's all positive. These are your strengths.
Right.
And you'll play to your strengths. So your strengths would mean you will make less blunders because you're not as impulsive as I am when making, say, a staffing decision or what have you. I can't delay. Like if I feel like I'm ready to do something, I have to do it. I have to move forward. And so your strengths will benefit you in different ways than my strengths will. But you're right. You have to load your team up with people who, because like my follow through is one of the scores is relatively low. So I have to surround myself with people that can take the idea and then bring it into fruition. Otherwise, there's this just stack of papers with half-baked thoughts.
Right. Well, I'm surprised then that your podcast is still going. I mean, you're going strong. I'm just kidding. So what are some other traits that it talks about that you find that were either insightful or different aspects of that test?
I think, like, for example, I had hired a hygienist. More of it's just the empathy that comes with it. And that's a key to leadership, I believe, is to understand where your people are coming from, because owners are owners and employees are employees. And I'm making a strong stereotype here, but generally speaking, it's the truth. And it's like, you know, that book, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, maybe vice versa. I think like there's two different languages, and the more the employee can understand the owner, the more the owner can understand the employee, then it just gets rid of a lot of that tension. So, for example, I had a hygienist, and I would explain something to her in like the most articulate, vivid detail that I could possibly explain.
Right.
And she would ask a question, and then she would ask another question, and then she would ask another question. And I literally got to the point where I was like, she's just stalling. She doesn't want to do it. But I really, really liked her. And then I saw her Kolbe, and her fact finder was like through the roof, and mine was low. And so anytime there's a big gap there, it's a point of contention. But now that I understood like her hard drive, her capacity to move forward was based on her ability to understand everything and how can I wrong her for that? She just wanted to do the right thing for me in the practice.
Right.
But if you don't understand that, it just ends up being a tension point.
Well, and it leads us to make assumptions about why they're doing what they're doing. Instead of thinking, oh, this is just who she is and she needs to deeply understand all aspects of this, we can easily think she's lazy and she doesn't want to do this.
You
Yeah,
think they have an ulterior motive?
totally.
Yes.
So that's awesome. That's something I had not heard of that test before. I'm going to include that in kind of the repertoire of learning about yourself and learning about your employees.
It costs like $50, and
Okay.
it will tell you more about yourself than you probably ever, stuff but you wonder, like for me, a quick start. I have a gigantic library over here to my left, and a majority of the books have a bookmark in them, meaning
Right.
I didn't finish them. So what happened? The next bright shiny object caught my attention, and I moved on to the next book.
Oh, that's so funny.
And now I didn't feel like it was pathological. I just felt like
that's who I am. That's okay.
That's exactly.
And you probably got the majority of the point from the section of the book, and then it repeats itself.
It's all contained in an executive summary somewhere anyway.
That's funny. And I just started listening to another podcast like 3 months ago, and there was 170 episodes, and so I went back to the beginning, and I've now finally caught up just this last week, and so it's another perfect example.
Persistent.
Yeah, well, it might be pathology, and maybe not. We'll see. But so with that. And going back to this idea of dentists, not that they shouldn't be owners, but, this idea of owners versus employees, what have been some personalities or signs or traits of dentists who have struggled that you've seen, either friends or, people you've worked with, people you've seen in different scenarios? Where do dentists struggle as owners?
I think my answer would fall in two words. One is lack of accountability, and two would be comfort with the status quo. So dentists in general will fit a certain personality, meaning if you look at your classmates, if you look at your colleagues, if you look at the state dental meeting when you're around, there tend to be a fair amount of wallflowers. So we're kind of introverted as a trait. We're
Sure.
kind of very scientific as a trait. And we were screened for that in a lot of ways. We tend to be, I think dentists have hearts of gold.
Right.
And so a lot of those things that you would, if you had a prototypical dentist or a stereotypical dentist, don't lend well at all to running a practice, meaning if your employees want to walk all over you and you have a high need to be liked, that can be difficult because they can drive your overhead up and drive your production down and, make an hour lunch break, 90 minutes, and
Right.
not get your patients seated on time.
And then that becomes the status quo. That becomes what's normal.
Exactly. Like, what can I do about it? The economy's down. The animals are running the zoo.
Right.
And what can I do about it? So that lends directly into accountability, meaning like, what can you learn to drive your practice forward? Or my belief, generally speaking, the life philosophy is that you're either growing or dying. And that lends to business as well, because the pace of technology, the pace of a lot of downward pressures, like on our fees, like insurance, it's rapidly changing. And
Right.
if you want your Monday to be like your last Monday, and if you want this year to be like last year, it's a difficult environment unless you're wanting to perpetually drive your practice up. And it doesn't have to be like 2x next year,
Right.
but 10%, 8%, 5% up. Because if you're not striving for that, and if you're not taking accountability, here's an example from my startup situation. I made every decision wrong. I started practice in a bad economy. I started a practice in a high cost of living area. I started a practice without much cash in the bank. I started a practice without a second income to support it. And my wife was pregnant. So my back was kind of against the wall.
You were all in. You'd burned the boats.
Exactly. I painted myself in a corner, but when you do that, you get really creative. So I thought marketing was essentially you blow up your business card 3x and put it in the newspaper and the phone will ring. Well, I quickly realized that it didn't, and people didn't care who I was and what I did. They wondered what I could do for them. And so when I stuck my neck out, when I did things that were completely uncomfortable for me, like go on the local TV station or go on the local radio station and do live interviews and things that were completely out of my comfort zone, then I realize what really works, what really connects with people, what really makes the phone ring. I mean, even during course of a day where I see, several dozen patients, for an introvert like me, it's a drain. Like I look forward to the weekend where I can just have quiet time. But if you have to decide what's more important, to be comfortable or to feed your family. And that's what accountability is all about to me.
And so the lack of that would be just this idea that it's your practice in the end. And so it's your little kingdom if you're going to grow it or not, or make it somewhere that you can be successful and happy or not. And no one else is going to push you to do that.
They're going to push you away from it. There's your patients all want you to be in network with a PPO. Your employees all want every day off. They don't want you to say no to them.
Right.
So there's your patients a lot of times don't even like to show up for their appointments.
Right.
So you have to be savvy, you have to be smart, and you have to figure out what's in it for them so that you can create what I call win-win agreements, meaning it's good for the practice, it's good for the team, and it's good for the patients.
Awesome. How did that transition work for you in terms of getting out of the Army and going to private practice? And so that's not what this podcast is about, but where were you before Colorado?
Mm-hmm.
And what kind of timeline was that like of you getting out of the military and then buying a practice? Did you have trouble getting financing, or how did that work for people like me or other people that I know that are in the military and potentially looking out and buying a practice? Some of the things that they might not be thinking about. Dr. Maloley's answer to that in a minute, but first, a word from our sponsor, Q Optics. Does anyone remember the case from the iPhone 3? I think it was 3S or 3G, whatever it was. And then also the old Galaxy S, Samsung Galaxy S. They were thick, bulky, black cases. And they weighed a little bit more. They weren't so sleek. When I look around at a lot of loops, that's what I see. I see these big, bulky cases holding the optics. And actually, when you look through the loops, you get a little frame. As you look through the little telescopes, you can see this black outline. And you get used to it. It's normal because you're using them all the time. But I never realized how much that frame took up until I tried on one of the pairs of Q Optics prismatic loops. I remember we were at Buca di Beppo, the Italian restaurant where they had given their presentation, and I put on the frame, and all I could see was these two perfect little circles of magnification without a black circle or an outline surrounding the optics. I could just see around the long telescopes without those taking up another portion of my field of view. Q Optics has taken a solid titanium unibody case with a carbon shroud encircling the lenses, and they've made it smaller, more lightweight, less in the way. If you're sick of wearing loops around that look like they have a iPhone 3 case on them, that look kind of dorky, and you want something that actually looks good and allows you to see around it, you should try out Q Optics. Give them an email at sales@q-optics.com. Use the promo code SP16 for $100 off your pair of loops or $300 off your loops and light combo. If you upgrade your smartphone when they come out with a better looking, better functioning, more lightweight version, why wouldn't you do the same with your loops? Q Optics, making better loops.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for serving. I mean, it says a lot about who you are, and furthermore, to make time to do a dental podcast while you're in residency was the furthest thing from my mind.
It's probably sadistic of myself, and I put my wife in charge. She can shut this down at any time if it gets out of hand. But thank you.
The military experience was phenomenal for me. I mean, it was during a really heavy deployment time in, post 9/11. Most of I didn't deploy to Afghanistan or Iraq, but most young officers that I worked with did.
Right.
So it more than it taught me about. That's not to put down my residency. I went from a pretty unconfident dentist coming out of dental school to a very highly confident dentist in 1 year, and that was in the residency. So I really appreciated that sort of clinical boot camp where I could start getting reps and start taking risks under specialists, as opposed to just trying to pass tests and, get some competency.
Sure.
But I always had an interest in practice management. And literally, I remember a giant box when I was stationed in Germany showing up. And it was this, some people aren't even going to know what I'm talking about, but my best friend from dental school shipped a box of 30 VHS tapes, and it was Howard Farran's 30-day MBA. And if you can imagine how big that box was, and I'd literally sat in the evening and watched these VHS tapes. So I was always kind of preparing.
Right.
But the one thing about military practice was that it was never very busy. So it did two things that it posed two challenges for me when I got into private practice. One was that I was incredibly slow because I had all the time I needed to see the patients that I needed.
Right. They call that comfortably busy. That pressure to produce isn't there. So it's ironic in that it's a great thing, and it also can lead to kind of being slow. And that's something I know I'm slower right now, and it's realistic for me being a year out of school to be slow, but I'm trying to work on that. I'm trying to be conscious of it. So what helped you kind of make that transition of being a little Army, military slower to being a little bit more private practice production?
It was just baptism by fire. I had to keep a quicker pace. In private practice, I think the challenge is you don't ever want to be rushed. You have to be present with your patients. They feel an energy if you're somewhere else or if you're slopping through a procedure. So your quality of work has to be really high, but there's a misnomer to think that there's only two things, meaning slow
equals quality.
Slow equals quality, and speed equals
right.
slop. There's a happy medium where you can be highly efficient, especially if your team members are highly trained, and deliver quality work. And sometimes the quicker I do the work, the better it looks anyway. So it's going from that conscious movement to, some of the stuff I'm in year 14, I can literally probably do it with one eye closed and it would turn out just fine. So some of it just comes with reps, but like in my practice, I started 7 years ago and I was really slow. So I was still slow clinically. And now my practice has a capacity problem. So I have to pick up the pace where my patients don't get seated in time. And if my patients don't get seated in time, then they're unhappy. And if they're unhappy, they don't refer. So it's a carrot that's perpetually out there. For me, it's not so much about the income. It's about doing things the right way for the right reasons and taking care of patients and making sure that they feel well taken care of.
No, and that is, there is definitely a happy medium, both in the military and outside of the military, of quality and efficiency, being present with the patients, highly trained staff, and on both sides, it can be done right. The pressures are just opposite,
Yes, absolutely. And some of it, for me, like to put it in a nutshell, like some of that doesn't come until it has to come.
And until the pressure is there.
I think they call that just-in-time learning.
That's exactly right. So speed was one factor. Did you have trouble getting lending out of the Army and buying a practice? You did a startup, correct?
I did. I was an associate for 2 years in North Carolina.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. So 2007. The answer to your question is yes. I had trouble getting lending, and I'll tell you why. 2007, I bought our dream home in North Carolina. Beautiful place. You could walk to the movie theater, to the wine bar. We had just left Europe, and so we were very much in that lifestyle mode. Like, we're designing our lifestyle. How do we want it to be? And so that was part of it. And so that was 2007. But you don't have to be a good historian to remember that the economy tanked in 2008. And so suddenly I was upside down in a house that I thought I was brilliant for buying, no money down VA loan.
It was such a good deal.
It was like, I thought it was brilliant. And I wasn't happy in my job. Kara wasn't happy in her job. And so we started looking for practices. And it's pretty, if you can find a decent practice that cash flows, getting financing isn't difficult. But I took the scenic route and found a place that I knew that we wanted to live in Colorado. And so when you're trying to buy a commercial space and you have no patients, no real way to get an associateship, and you're upside down in that house in North Carolina, it makes it
Sure.
challenging. But one of my life philosophies is there's always a way if you're committed. And I worked and honed the business plan. And I remember the lender saying, "Where did you get this?" Because it was very well thought out. Some of the things I've still, despite all the challenges, I still haven't strayed from. Still becomes fundamental to our practice and our practice growth.
That's awesome.
And so, as like I said at the very beginning, like when you have that desire and you know what you want, if it's to own your own private practice, you'll find a way. The barricades, the hurdles, the walls are just there to keep the people who don't want it bad enough out, in my opinion.
And that's awesome that you're sharing a little bit more of that journey, because I think there's always a plunge. There's always a kind of leap of faith of just going for it. And yours just happens to be a little bit higher of a dive and a deeper of a plunge than most. And so it's awesome to hear your story making it work despite all those. And I do recommend that people don't do all of those things that you just did, which I believe, I mean, if it's worth it and it's going to build your lifestyle and you know that going in, then you can make it work. But
there's smarter ways to do it.
Well,
I'm happy to yeah.
And the thing is that you have to know what you're up against. And if you realize beforehand that you have all these things against you, and so therefore your practice management, your leadership, your vision, your systems all have to be better because of these things, then that's different than thinking, oh, I'll just open my practice in Vail and then getting blindsided when it doesn't all just show up at your doorstep.
Those days of hanging the shingle and the phone ringing off the hook are few and far between, unless you're in a rural area and the demand is like, one dentist to 5,000 population. Sure. You better have your ducks in a row and you better have a sound strategy. You're exactly right.
And I'm sorry, I keep diving a little deeper here. So between your associateship and the first patient, so leaving your associateship and that first patient coming in the door, how much time was that for you to do your startup? How long was that turnaround?
I think I resigned in like August of 2007. I did some little locum tenens gigs, just trying to keep a paycheck going for a while. And then we moved to Colorado in October, and I finally got the practice open 2 months later, and I was way behind schedule. I had to fight the contractors and the permitting and the equipment guys. And there's a book called The Art of the Start, and it says in that book, I remember nothing about that book except the one thing that says everything will take twice as long and cost twice as much as you think. And I think I was right on pace.
That was about exactly right for a dental practice startup. If you could wrap up this discussion of practice ownership, is it still worth it? And if it is, and you're that kind of person that wants it and is willing to pay the price and is willing to get the education, is willing to push through the obstacles, what would be your advice to that new grad that either just graduated this year or last year, in the last couple of years, and is afraid to take that plunge and is afraid to move towards practice ownership?
That's an awesome question. And for me, the answer is really simple, because legacy is what drives every single one of my actions. Meaning, I think if you're timid, you have to decide literally like on your deathbed. Well, you look at your grandchildren, we look at your kids and say, God, I wish I would have started that dental practice when I was 32 or when I was 28. Or would you say, I am so proud I started that dental practice when I was 32 or 28. When you put it in the grand scheme, when you reverse engineer like that, the big risks don't seem quite so risky. And you realize that not taking the risk is the biggest risk, because, I mean, I don't want to get over philosophical or, and sometimes this talk about death sounds like doom and gloom, but I think it's the ultimate freedom, meaning like that is certain. We all have an expiration date, right, and we don't know when it is. So if you get one roll of the dice or one play at the game, then you better play full out and not, there's a study called the top regrets of the dying. Okay. And usually it's because something that itched at them and they never did it. And I don't want to be that guy. And that's really the main reason I started the Relentless Dentist Podcast, is because I felt like some people needed some courage, some people needed some confidence, and some people just needed to know, like, even your favorite dental idol who you think all of his cases turn out beautiful and that his path was paved with gold, they have challenges. They have patients that get upset. They have bad reviews on Google. They have times where they wonder if there's going to be any money at the end of the month. And so I saw, I'll just summarize something I saw on Facebook as a nice quote that was kind of enlightening to me this week. And it said, it's hard to be prosperous and it's hard to be poor. Choose your hard. And so you just have to put it in the grand scheme and then reverse engineer it. What will you be proud of at the end of your days? Like, for example, you're going to have a casket with a flag that's red, white, and blue on it. And a lot of people won't. So that's something that your offspring will be really proud of, and they'll remember it. I've never gone to a funeral that had that didn't like strike a chord with me. And so, do you want practice ownership or do you want to be employed? Maybe recreation is more important to you. Each person has their own formula for success, but creating a lifestyle that you really desire, I think, starts with the end. Begin with the end in mind, and then figure out what steps it takes to get there.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much. I really appreciate all your kind of opening up and sharing some specific details, some encouragement, some advice. And I really think that there are people out there, and that's why you're doing your podcast, I'm doing mine, that think they want this, but they're not sure. And maybe they don't have the skills, maybe they don't have the confidence, maybe they don't have the speed yet, and are afraid to take that plunge because they think, oh, I have to have more saved and I have to have more experience and more confidence. And eventually at some point, it's never going to be perfect.
Exactly.
Even when you go for it, everything's going to, there's always going to be challenges. But the question is, am I building something I'm going to be proud of? And I really appreciate your perspective on that. So thank you so much, Dr. Maloley, for the interview and for the time today.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks for what you're doing.
Awesome. Hey, take care. Okay, and we're back. Hopefully you guys really enjoyed that interview. I loved talking with Dr. Maloley, and I've really enjoyed his podcast. You guys can check it out. It's called the Relentless Dentist Podcast. We'll have a link to it in the show notes. And in the rest of this season 1, I really want to dive into the other things that are concerning new grads. So finding a job, analyzing it, negotiating, getting the most out of your first associateships. Also learning things like how to learn new procedures, which CE to take, how to give yourself a business education, whether or not you should do AEGDs or GPRs. And then lastly, the financial aspects of being a new doc, of student loans and saving and liquidity and how to balance all of that, especially with the idea of I'm going to own my own practice. So all of these are in the context of getting to practice ownership sooner rather than later. Thank you again to New Villager for letting us use their music. Please leave us a review on iTunes, share this with your friends, and if you know of anyone who is willing to talk about any corporate experiences they've had, please direct them my way, richard@sharedpractices.com.